The East European Upheavals, German Unification, and the Future of Marxism. The Continuing Relevance of the Concepts of State Capitalism and Marxist Humanism. By Kevin Anderson. Reflexive Statement. This article is a product of over 2 decades of support work for East European dissident movements of the independent socialist type, dating from my first involvement with opposing the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968 while a member of Students for a Democratic Society. In the summer of 1990, I was able to visit Berlin and Prague and to meet some of these independent radicals face to face. In addition, I have worked for some years on theoretical issues with regard to how radical humanists in the West could conceptualize the nature of official communist systems. This led me to the concepts of state capitalism and Marxist humanism. This article was finished in June 1991, just before the final disintegration of the communist system in the USSR. Since then, the lands of the former USSR have evolved into a manner roughly similar to the formerly communist societies of Eastern Europe. Introduction. As the year 1991 opened, the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev's trusted colleague, Eduard Shevardnadze, who warned of the danger of a new dictatorship, only underlined the sense of deep crisis in the Soviet Union. The daily headlines, from food shortages in Moscow, to the election in Poland, to the reports of millions of refugees heading west, and of the new unrest throughout the Soviet Union and East Europe, showed the deepening crisis in all of the lands which once comprised the system built by Stalin and maintained by his successors. 1 year earlier, in the fall and winter of 1989-90, tens of millions came into the streets in a series of sudden and unexpected mass revolts, which, at a stroke, toppled more than 40 years of single-party rule in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia, and in Romania. More drawn-out but equally dramatic changes were also taking place in Hungary, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, and most importantly, Poland. The result was the sudden breakup of a whole empire, sweeping away not only the Berlin Wall, but also the old ruling classes. Yet with the fall of statist communism came still newer challenges, as deep contradictions emerged within the democratic movements themselves. East Europe is a region which has produced the 1953 East German Workers' Uprising with its slogan, quote, "Bread and Freedom," the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 with its workers' councils, and the Prague Spring of 1968 with its debates over socialist and Marxist humanism. Poland's Solidarity labor movement of 1980 to 81 made the issue of workers' control central. A new society different from either Western capitalism or Russian communism was posed within each of these movements. Yet today, there is the danger of being swept into a private capitalism of the Reagan-Thatcher variety, as many are gripped by the notion that there is no third way between capitalism and statist communism. In 1968, before it was crushed by Brezhnev's tanks, Czechoslovakia, with its espousal of the radically democratic concept, quote, "socialism with a human face," and with its many discussions of Marxist humanism, exemplified best the essentially leftist character of many of the East European opposition movements of that era. Yet by the 1980s and 1990s, the ideology of the Western-type, quote, "free market," end quote, seemed to hold sway everywhere. Does this mean that the 1989 to 90 upheavals were not only a repudiation of statist communism, but also of all forms of socialism and Marxism? I will attempt to address this question by making a brief sketch of the political situation since 1989 in former East Germany, Poland and the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia and Romania. I will forego an examination of either Yugoslavia or Albania, where the outcome is still very unclear, and where the old political systems are not directly dependent on Moscow. Especially in Yugoslavia, the situation is extremely complicated, with some democratic socialists having cast in their lot with the ultra-nationalist Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic. Particular attention will be given to the former East Germany, not only because its revolt was the first major upheaval of 1989, preceding those in Czechoslovakia and Romania, but also because it is here that leftist and Marxist currents are relatively stronger than elsewhere in Eastern Europe. I will seek to demonstrate that leftist movements and ideas, although frequently marginalized, persist today. I will also try to argue that there were many implicitly anti-capitalist demands and aspirations in the mass upheavals of 1989 to 90, even when they were to a great extent dominated ideologically by the lure of a, quote, affluent, end quote, Western-style market economy. A more theoretical issue posed by the 1989 to 90 upheavals is the question of the, quote, death of Marxism. If by Marxism means the reigning ideologies of statist communism, then it may be dead. However, there are strands of Marxism other than these official ones, currents which are hardly discredited, and in many respects vindicated, by the 1989 to 90 upheavals and their aftermath. I will single out two of these strands for discussion: the theory of state capitalism and the concept of Marxist humanism. The theory of state capitalism offers critical insights into the structure of, and the contradictions within, statist communism, while Marxist humanism offers a radical subject-centered vision of a liberated society going beyond either capitalism or statist communism. German unification, contradictions and oppositional currents. While there is no denying that the population of both East and West Germany yearned for unification, the masses and the elite saw the process quite differently. For the masses, it meant reunification of families and friends, freedom to travel, other democratic liberties, and the hope of a higher standard of living. For the elites, it meant expanded international power, a cheap labor supply to exploit in Eastern Germany, and fortunes to be made from speculation in land and commercial properties. Even before unification, West Germany was the dominant power in the West European economic community. A united Germany will extend that power still further, while at the same time becoming a major economic power in East Europe, and perhaps even in the Soviet Union itself. If hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union continue to fade in the next few years, it is possible that Germany and the United States will themselves become rivals for economic and political power in Europe. The elites are relieved that, as against 1989 to 90, politics is now taking place mainly in established bodies like the parliament with all the old political parties in charge. But as I saw when I visited Berlin in 1990, to many activists and ordinary people, something has been lost, even betrayed, since the 1989 revolt when millions took to the streets to demand freedom. The most detailed account to date of the fate of the mainly leftist opposition movement in East Germany discusses the developments after the wall came down under the category, quote, the lost revolution, end quote. See Allen, 1991. At the same time, many contradictions remain. Take one of the most debated contradictions: the former East Germany's stronger laws in the area of women's rights, which will now be replaced by West German law. Most of the debate has been over the infamous paragraph 218 of the West German Constitution, which has been interpreted by the courts as severely limiting the right to abortion, requiring a woman to get both a doctor and a social worker to attest that having the baby would endanger her health. A demonstration against paragraph 218, held in Bonn in June 1990, drew 15,000 people, mainly West German, but including as a speaker Christina Schenk of the East German Independent Women's Association, referring to the East German law which provides a woman's right to choose in state-funded abortions up to the 12th week of pregnancy. Schenk stated, quote, "We demand at the very least the enactment of this law for a united Germany," end quote. By July 1990, over 100,000 East Germans had written to their government demanding that the current abortion laws be kept. in a dramatic demonstration against conservative East German Prime Minister Lothar de Maizière, women held up a sign which read, quote, "If the rubber has a tear in it, dear Lothar, what then?" End quote. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, 1990. As a result of these protests, the enforcement of Propaganda 218 was put off until 1994 in the former East Germany. The Independent Women's Association certainly did not hold up the old East German laws as any general model, however. Their election platform for March 1990 pointed out that East German women earned only 75% of the wages of men, and that women did 80% of the housework. The women demanded, quote, that structurally important sectors of the economy be transformed from state property into genuinely collectively owned property, and that they be protected against privatization, end quote. The women have also had to face elitism from left groups. In the March 1990 election, noted Peter Marcuse, quote, in the East, an electoral coalition between the Greens and the very progressive and competent Independent Women's Association broke down when, as a result of a quirk in the electoral arrangements, all of the coalition's 8 seats went to Greens, none to Independent Women, and the Greens refused to surrender even one of their seats to adhere to the spirit of the coalition agreement, end quote. Other protests have been over economic conditions. In my several visits to West Germany over the past decade, I could easily see the growing effects of 15 years of high unemployment, ever since the 1974 oil crisis. Before 1974, unemployment averaged less than 1%, but since the 1974 oil crisis, unemployment has increased steadily, averaging over 6% of the entire decade for the entire decade of 1988 to 1989, according to the OECD Economic Outlook of 1990. This, combined with the conservative Kohl government's austerity policies, has led to homelessness, drug addiction, and higher crime rates. Simply walking around the train stations in Berlin or Frankfurt and seeing the homeless and the panhandlers quickly belies any notion of West Germany as a prosperous country so different from the rest. In the East, working people face the prospect of eviction from their already cramped apartments due to claims from former, quote, owners, now living in the West whose property was nationalized. They also face skyrocketing rents due to real estate speculation. On the job, many workers will face new managers, either Westerners or retooled communists, who are attempting to lay them off or to slash their already miserable wages and benefits. There have been many strikes and demonstrations by working people in 1990 and 1991. Those in July 1990 involved 30,000 metal workers who went on wildcat strikes to demand a hefty wage increase in Western currency, reduced hours, and most importantly, no layoffs. They got a promise of no layoffs before July 1991, a wage increase, and were promised a 40-hour work week. More big strikes by railroad workers took place in the former East Germany in late 1990, directed against the possibility of layoffs. By March 1991, tens of thousands of workers and other citizens poured into the streets of Leipzig and other large cities in East Germany, where they expressed outrage over the rising unemployment rate and the deterioration of their standard of living since unification. The new demonstrations began on Monday, March 18th, in an attempt to rekindle the weekly Monday night Leipzig demonstrations which had been so crucial to toppling the communist regime in the fall of 1989. The protest kept up for several weeks, by which time Kohl was booed and pelted with eggs when he visited the eastern city of Erfurt. East German students have also been on the move. In June 1990, 10,000 East German students demonstrated and sat in outside the parliament in Berlin with signs such as bread and books and strung along again. They were protesting against their low financial aid allotments at a time of raging inflation. They demanded that pension money for the secret police be redirected to scholarships and that military institutions be shut down and converted into housing to alleviate the severe shortage. About the situation at Leipzig University, in the former East Germany, one student eyewitness wrote, quote, "All the professors are trying to prove how able they are to teach things as the Social Democrats see them, just as they formerly taught what the Communist Party saw fit. Accommodation and assimilation is the word," end quote. The lack of fundamental differences between the East and the capitalist West is seen especially well in how easily some of the old bureaucrats, managers, and ideologues are adjusting to the changeover. The December 1990 all-German elections were as a whole a victory for Helmut Kohl's conservative coalition. In this general climate of conservatism, however, it was notable that the Alliance 90, an independent left slate composed of New Forum, Greens, and other former opposition groups in East Germany, actually did far better at the polls than did their better established West German counterparts, such as the Green Party and the West Berlin Alternative Liste. Is Alliance 90 the proto-Die Linke? The Die Linke forerunner? I gotta look that up. No, it's not. It's not. It's I think it later merged with the Green Party. And later in the 90s, it merged with the Green Party. In her acceptance speech for a, quote, Democracy Prize in 1990, New Forum leader Barbu Lăzăreanu alluded to the, quote, encrusted nature of Western democracy's, quote, traditional representative system, end quote, and called for a, quote, revolution to establish, quote, real democracy. All of this suggests that a radical opposition will continue to exist in the former East Germany, and perhaps even grow if economic and social conditions continue to deteriorate. It was thus no accident that Germany experienced the most massive demonstrations against the Gulf War of any European country. Crisis in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The crisis was even deeper in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe by 1991. The November 1990 Polish elections showed serious disillusionment with the new, quote, free market, end quote, policies of the post-communist regime. The first round of the Polish presidential elections gave a humiliating 18% of the vote to Mazowiecki, the candidate most identified with austerity, layoffs, and privatization. Even Solidarity founder Lech Walesa, I don't know how you say it. I think it's, let's see. It's funny when you see a name that you know a million times. I highly recommend, by the way, if you are interested in such things, to check out the movie Man of Marble and Man of Steel, which were made by the Polish director Andrzej Wajda, about they're the dramatic films, they're fictional films, but they're about like basically dissidents in communist Poland, and they're very good movies. I really recommend them.
Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa.
Lech Walesa.
Lech Walesa.
Even Solidarity founder Lech Walesa, who promised to continue Mazowiecki's economic plan with a few unspecified, quote, corrections, end quote, received only 40% of the vote. The biggest shock was that no less than 23% voted for the completely unknown eccentric emigre businessman Stanislav Tymiński in an apparent protest vote against austerity. Solidarity membership had plunged from 10 million in 1981 to less than 2 million today. And more recently, the union and the political movement built around it has splintered. Walesa's camp drew to itself most of Poland's anti-Semitic vote, using subtle public appeals which stopped just short of open anti-Semitism. If you look up the... it was kind of a weird thing. I can't remember the person's name. They have a book in the Marcel Stutzler's book, Critical Theory and the Critique of Anti-Semitism, about anti-Semitism in Poland and in contemporary Poland, and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And one of the things that I've heard her talk about in a lecture that she gave was something to the effect that Jews that lived in Poland were kind of like pushed from two sides. On the one hand, there was the so-called anti-Zionist purges, where, like, I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, but it basically like 1,000 or more, I think like 1,000 or more Jews, I think thousands of Jews basically had their careers ruined in Eastern Poland because they were viewed as, they were labeled Zionists, which is just kind of like a code word for Jew, and they were viewed without grounds as like a third camp that was like somehow seeking to overthrow the Polish state, and were disloyal to the Polish state and more loyal to Israel. But on the other hand, she was saying that there was this other tension where it was like, on the one hand, I think some might have participated in the Solidarność, and some Jews might have participated in that, and some people in Solidarność might have protested this. I'm not exactly sure, but because Solidarność, one of its principal means of organizing was via the Catholic Church. She said something to the effect that the organization of Solidarity was often viewed through the Catholic Church. People often either embraced open anti-Semitism. Sometimes, it's not to say cast Solidarity as anti-Semitic, but it created an exclusion for Jews, which made their open participation in the project difficult. So it makes sense hearing it again when Anderson says, Walesa's camp drew to itself most of Poland's anti-Semitic vote using subtle public appeals which stopped just short of open anti-Semitism. Walesa's willingness to stoke the fires of a latent but deeply rooted anti-Semitism is a chilling harbinger of the future, and not only for Poland. The tragic irony here is that it was Walesa who in the early 1980s hit out against all forms of anti-Semitism and who included Jews such as Adam Michnik among his close colleagues. Today, Walesa has fallen so low as to allow anti-Semitic attacks from the floor at his own campaign meetings to go unanswered. In 1991, the National Parliament stopped just short of banning abortion completely, a move demanded by the Catholic Church and supported by both Walesa and Mazowiecki. Severe restrictions have already been quietly enacted. Tilbury and Hakanos, 1991. Quote, so many women were in the underground, were part of the fight for freedom, and now it seems that freedom, that victory, is not for women, end quote, stated Jolanta Płachwicz of the newly formed Polish Feminist Alliance. Despite these grave contradictions within Solidarity, the Polish people are far from quiescent. In late 1990, 70 of the country's 74 hard coal mines went out on strike against austerity measures. Youth have demonstrated against the planned opening of Poland's first ever nuclear power plant in Żarnow, a plant which has the same design as the one in Chernobyl. In the summer of 1990, a trash-burning incinerator, an environmentally dangerous joint venture by Austrian and German capital, was built at a military base in western Poland. But the day before it was to go into operation, 500 farmers from the area drove onto the base in their tractors and completely destroyed the new incinerator. In the Soviet Union, actual famine loomed by the winter of 1990 to 91. For the first time since World War II, food rationing was proposed in Leningrad, where the following near-starvation quotas per person per month: 3.3 pounds of meat, 1.1 pound of butter, 10 eggs. Every major ethnic and national group is demanding self-determination or even independence after several decades of iron rule under what Lenin warned against on his deathbed, quote, Great Russian Chauvinism. Lenin wrote that it was represented by the Stalin wing of the party. It continues today in a different form. In January 1991, Gorbachev's liberal mask seemed to come off, as troops from the Interior Ministry attacked independence activists in Lithuania and Latvia, killing 19 people. But instead of fear, the new attempt at a crackdown stirred outrage and mass demonstrations, not only in the Baltics but in Moscow itself, where hundreds of thousands took to the streets against repression and for dismantling of the single-party state on January 20th. Similar massive rallies were held on February 24th, March 10th, and March 28th, the latter in defiance of a ban on rallies backed up by the presence of 50,000 troops, or I think it might be 5,000 troops, and police with water cannons. It's a little typo here. It says 50/00. I can assume there's going to be a zero. I can guess that it's either the zero goes at the end of that, and that's 50,000, or that the comma goes back a space. By April, a nationwide coal miners' strike begun a month earlier threatened to weaken the economy still further, a strike which had the political dimension of demanding Gorbachev's resignation as well as voicing grievances over conditions of life and labor. The new independent unions set up by the miners were modeled on Poland's Solidarity movement, and the deep nature of their grievances was expressed by one leader, Viktor Filominov, who stated, quote, Life forced us to be the, quote, vanguard. We didn't choose it. Our strength is that we have nothing to lose anymore, end quote. Viktor Filominov. Once a new economic austerity plan went into effect on April 10th, more mass strikes and demonstrations of working people took place, especially in Minsk, a key industrial center, where it soon became a general strike. As the strikes grew, Gorbachev suddenly reversed course, patching up relations with liberal opposition politicians such as Boris Yeltsin, who had previously called for his resignation. Gorbachev seemed to agree to greater autonomy for the various republics, while the liberals agreed to ask the workers to end their strikes. Yeltsin's, quote, solution, agreed to by Gorbachev, was for the government of his Russian Republic to take over the mines and rapidly introduce, quote, market mechanisms. Workers across the Soviet Union have formed a wide variety of independent unions, newspapers, and strike committees. Intense debates are taking place over the future direction of the labor movement. Some of the workers' groups advocate a, quote, market economy, while others stand for workers' control of economic institutions. All are disillusioned with the present system. A year after the overthrow of the old system, there is also a deep sense of crisis in Czechoslovakia and Romania. In Czechoslovakia, a large, nonviolent mass protest movement toppled the old system and brought the vastly popular Civic Forum to power in 1989. Yet by 1990, politics had turned so far to the right that the government backed the U.S. drive to war in the Middle East, as seen in Bush's November visit to Prague. Racist incidents against foreign workers and students are occurring with sickening regularity, often sparked by neo-fascist skinheads. I witnessed one such unprovoked attack on Vietnamese workers on a crowded Prague subway car in broad daylight in June 1990. A Czech political activist accompanying me and other passengers intervened to stop the racists. As to women's rights, there have also been some backward steps. There is pressure for women to go back into the home. The display of pornography virtually everywhere is considered part of the new, quote, freedom, and the Civic Forum refuses to take a position on abortion. At the same time, however, small groups of youth and intellectuals are debating radical ideas, from Trotskyism to anarchism to Marxist humanism, as can be seen in Polarita, the newspaper of the newly formed group Left Alternative. In addition, a group of left intellectuals, including the prominent Marxist humanist philosopher Karel Kosík, have in recent years formed the Obroda Club. Most of the Obroda Club's members are former communists who were involved in the 1968 Prague Spring experiment with a socialist humanist alternative. Expelled from the party, fired from their jobs, and sometimes jailed after the 1968 Soviet invasion, they still hold to varying forms of socialist ideas today. In Romania, the mass insurrection which toppled the murderous Ceausescu regime was hijacked by Ion Iliescu and his clique of former party and army officials. Their National Salvation Front, to a great extent merely a renamed communist party, managed to win the May 1990 elections, but has faced student revolt and most recently, worker unrest. In the fall of 1990, dock workers went on strike for a week in Constanza, the main port, in order to gain the dismissal of their corrupt union leadership. Mass protests also continued against the regime's austerity measures, which include drastic price hikes for basic commodities, as part of the conversion to a, quote, market economy, end quote. The East European upheavals of 1989 to 90 have certainly created freedom of social and political expression and organization, necessary first steps towards a humanist future. Yet overall, the labor, women's, and youth movements have been placed very much on the defensive, even though creative activities from the grassroots continued as 1991 began. New ruling elites were rapidly consolidating their power. There was also a very hostile ideological climate facing anyone who tried to discuss Marxist or even socialist ideas. Some Marxist theories of state capitalism. Recently, the second generation of Frankfurt School member Jürgen Habermas has argued that the East European upheavals represent part of the unified project of modernization, opposing any notion of a, quote, middle way between Western capitalism and, quote, state socialism. Jürgen Habermas rejects the socialist humanism of the young Marx as, quote, romantic socialism, end quote, and calls instead for something far less radical, quote, transforming socialist ideas into the radically reformist self-criticism, end quote, of existing capitalist society. From a different standpoint, world system theorist Emanuel Wallerstein in 1990 writes that the upheavals show a repudiation of the modernizing project of statist communism and its ideology of rapid industrialization at any cost. This project has reached an impasse today because, quote, all developmentalist ideologies are becoming defunct, end quote. These ideologies based themselves on, quote, the seizure of state power by a party claiming to incarnate the popular will and using state power to, quote, develop the country, end quote. Thus, to Wallerstein, the collapse of statist communism means a rejection of Marxist-Leninism, but not of Marxism, because Marxism, quote, did not start out as an ideology of national development and is not doomed to be understood only in this constrictive fashion, end quote. Instead of the death of Marxism and of its project of human liberation, Wallerstein writes, quote, perhaps it is only now that we can invent utopian utopias, end quote. Thus, Wallerstein, unlike Habermas, sees a future for radically emancipatory strands of Marxism. Ever since the 1940s, state capitalist theory and later Marxist humanism have attempted to work out such a radical break with Stalinist as well as social democratic orthodoxy, both of which were based on industrialization and modernization as keys to human emancipation, rather than on the de-alienation of labor of human relations in a liberated society. Such radically emancipatory notions were dubbed, quote, idealistic and, quote, utopian by both varieties of socialist orthodoxy as well as by traditional Trotskyism, which argues that societies such as the Soviet Union are deformed worker states. In the case of the Soviet Union, the term usually uses degenerated worker states and deformed worker states, being reserved by Orthodox Trotskyists to describe the countries that were not forged from a socialist revolution but by conquest via the USSR's victory in World War II. Side note for myself. State capitalist theories have argued that modern capitalism as a whole exhibits the characteristic of state intervention in the economy, a tendency taken to a fully developed form under a single-party state as in the Soviet Union under Stalin or Nazi Germany. The disadvantage of state capitalist theories, their critics argue, is that they oversimplify the differences between market economies and state-run economies, minimizing crucial issues such as the existence of private property. The advantages of state capitalist theories in analyzing the present situation are several. 1. State capitalist theories help explain the relative ease with which many of the former communist bureaucrats of today welcome the transition to a market economy. This helps clarify the role of both reform communists such as Gorbachev's supporters as well as ex-communists who have begun to thrive in Poland and elsewhere as private business opportunities have emerged. 2. State capitalist theories helped us to cut through highly ideological rhetoric about, quote, free markets. Did the monopolistic oil industry or that large U.S. bureaucracy, the Pentagon, really come under greater, quote, free market control in the 1980s? Was the West German economy, which exhibited an even greater degree of government planning, really a free market society? 3. Finally, were the basic conditions of the working people inside the factory and other workplaces fundamentally different in the Soviet Union and similar societies from those in the West? Did not Marx's concept of alienated labor, as developed in 1844 and elaborated in Capital, also have explanatory power even for societies where the economy was in the hands of the state? This last point helps to account for the persistence of labor and class struggles of three types. 1. The Polish Solidarity movement in the 1980s directed against statist communism. 2. The massive miners' strikes in 1989 and 91 in the Soviet Union directed against Gorbachev's mixture of statist communism and Western capitalism. 3. The new mass strikes and demonstrations against austerity and unemployment by working people in Eastern Germany after unification. An important early elaboration of the concept of state capitalism was that of the Frankfurt School's Friedrich Pollock. Postone and Brick, 1982, write that his 1941 article on state capitalism was the economic underpinning of the critical pessimism of the entire Frankfurt School, thus belying the notion that these theorists were concerned only with philosophy and culture. In brief, Pollock advanced the following propositions. 1. Nazi Germany, and to a lesser extent Stalin's Russia, represented new state capitalist forms of economy and society. 2. Planning replaced the market as the locus of economic activity. 3. The traditional, quote, profit motive, end quote, was, quote, superseded by the power motive, end quote. 4. Civil and labor rights are crushed by the state. 5. War and conquest are a fundamental characteristic of the system. 6. In its totalitarian form, such a system could, with relative success, overcome many of the class and economic contradictions of traditional capitalism. In this latter sense, his model is rather static. In the early 1940s, Pollock's concept of state capitalism was challenged by other critical theorists. But as against Habermas's position, in this period, most members of the Frankfurt School favored a radical transformation of all forms of capitalism and the establishment of mass-based revolutionary institutions of direct democracy, such as workers' councils. Nearly 2 decades later, Herbert Marcuse published the only full-length analysis by a Frankfurt School member of the Soviet Union. It was surprisingly uncritical and did not use a concept of state capitalism. Thus, the critical theorist never really developed Pollock's concept of state capitalism as a critique of Soviet-type societies. Yeah, that's actually really important for myself, because I was always curious, like, what were the critical theorists' overall positions on the Soviet Union. The one thing that I do know is that I think someone asked Adorno one time about like what he thought of like the contemporary Soviet Union, and that like his conception of the Soviet Union was highly influenced by Trotsky's "The Revolution Betrayed." So, at the very least, not a Stalinist. Whether he was, what conception he would have embraced about the USSR is, I think, as Anderson is here pointing out, not particularly clear. In 1941, the same year that Pollock published his analysis of state capitalism, the Caribbean Marxist C.L.R. James and the Russian-born former Trotsky secretary Raya Dunayevskaya each wrote discussion articles on Stalin's Russia as a state capitalist society for the U.S. Workers' Party, a Trotskyist group. Since James wrote under the pseudonym J.R. Johnson and Dunayevskaya under the name Freddie Forrest, the group that gathered around them soon gained the name Johnson-Forrest Tendency, although they preferred to call it the State Capitalist Tendency. Where Pollock worked within the more academic setting of the Frankfurt School, James and Dunayevskaya involved themselves not only in theoretical issues, but also in labor activism and the black struggle. Despite their non-academic backgrounds, however, James and especially Dunayevskaya actually elaborated a more detailed and economically grounded concept of state capitalism than did the Frankfurt School theorist Pollock. As recorded in the Raya Dunayevskaya collection, besides their initial 1941 articles, Dunayevskaya wrote articles based on original Russian sources of the New International on the economic structure of Soviet state capitalism, and also debated the pro-Soviet economists Paul Baran and Oskar Lange on state capitalism in the American Economic Review. In 1950, in collaboration with Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, by then another theoretician in the Johnson-Forrest Tendency, James wrote State Capitalism and World Revolution, a lengthy pamphlet which has recently been reissued. After the breakup of the Tendency in the 1950s, James moved more into cultural and third world issues. Dunayevskaya, who had been the group's most prolific contributor on the issue of state capitalism in the 1940s, continued to work on the issue of state capitalism and included a lengthy discussion of the concept in her Marxism and Freedom, first published in 1958. Among the key concepts of this theory of state capitalism developed further in the 1950s by Dunayevskaya were the following. 1. The Soviet Union, like Western capitalist economies, seeks after surplus value for capital accumulation. As in the West, The Soviet Union does so by paying the workers a minimum and extracting them a maximum of unpaid labor. Thus, Marx's law of value continues to hold in the Soviet Union. This differs sharply from Pollock's concept of the, quote, primacy of the political, end quote. It's a question whether that surplus took the form of value or not in the Soviet Union. That would be like a criticism that people could make, potentially, of state capitalist theories. Although I myself am sympathetic to state capitalist theories, but say like not a degenerated worker state. I mean, I don't know if Anderson's going to discuss Shachtman and the bureaucratic collectivist third campus school of Soviet analysis, but that's something to consider. Is like, you can absolutely say that a society is extremely exploitative and repressive and alienated, and not have it organized around value categories, such as commodity, money, value, value categories. Also, it doesn't mean and it's like also I think you could say like and that's what the merit of bureaucratic collectivism theories is that you can whether or not Stalinism constituted a anti-capitalist or not doesn't really a serious anti-capitalism, which I think in certain ways you could, insofar as it was definitely hostile, more or less hostile to like market activity. It was still extremely exploitative and repressive. So and that's kind of like one of the points at which Trotsky has criticized the Soviet leadership but praised their so-called economic achievements. But the politics of the Soviet Union and their economic achievements were not like two distinct things. You're talking about industrialization and collectivization in the Soviet Union. That was fueled by the most repressive and bureaucratic and straight up barbaric aspects of Stalinist Russia, of the Stalinist bureaucracy. So yeah, basically, I'm getting off track here. Just saying, you'd have to demonstrate that exploitation took the form of value exploitation, I think, to say that it was whether or not the Soviet Union was capitalist or not. Demonstrating that it was an extremely exploitative, alienated form of social life, like that Dunayevskaya, according to Anderson here, says that it repressed working, repressed the consumption and welfare of the working population in order to expand its economic capacity. I mean, that is how you develop a country. Is especially when you're trying to industrialize a country fast, is that you need to exploit the shit out of labor in order to have something to put into accumulation. That is what accumulation is. It is the product of surplus labor being reinvested in further production, with the same goal in mind, to at more exploitation ad infinitum, at least in capitalism. But that's kind of like always the thing within like Soviet type societies, is that they're kind of like, there's always like, oh, we'll have difficulties now and later. It's a type of like Stalinist austerity. I think might be a nice helpful term to use. Anyway, sorry. 2. Alienated labor, not private property, and the means of production is the hallmark of capitalism. This is what Marx argued in his essay on alienated labor in the 1844 manuscripts, when he stated that private property was merely a surface manifestation of something deeper, alienated labor, which turned the worker into a thing. Just a side note, again, is that I do not believe that the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 were published until the 1930s. So that it's always important to keep in mind, Michael Heinrich talks about this, is how every generation of people who read Marx are coming into contact with a different Marx due to the publication histories of various things. So in the case of the 1844 manuscripts, where the concept of alienated labor is talked about most explicitly, even though obviously, alienated concepts of alienation, and the carry on throughout Marx's work in less explicitly stated forms. Just as a side note, just to say that, yeah, you should you have to consider the publication history. I'm not as much of an expert on it, but I believe the German ideology kind of has a similar history. So the German ideology has like a very tumultuous publication history. So yeah, basically like the generation around Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky, they didn't have access to the 1844 manuscripts. Or at least not until maybe Trotsky had access to them later in his life, but not for most of his political career. 3. State capitalism was even more centralized than monopoly capitalism, a point foreseen by Marx when he wrote in Capital of a tendency toward the whole economy being swallowed up by a single capitalist. Merely shifting from private to state property in the means of production would not uproot alienated labor, nor obviously would he shift back to privatization. As Dunayevskaya wrote, quote, "Communism continues to spend incredible time and energy and vigilance to imprison Marx within the bounds of the private property versus state property concept," end quote. Dunayevskaya. So too do anti-Marxist, quote, free market ideologues. 4. Under state capitalism, competition did not disappear, but competition took on more than before the form of war and conquest, the drive for a single world domination. Military competition between states became extremely important in establishing the world market. Yes, it seems like it would have to be demonstrated, I think, that there's internal competition within the Soviet Union in order to demonstrate its capitalist nature, not merely that it has to participate in the world market. But 5. Dunayevskaya wrote in Marxism and Freedom that under state capitalism, the fetishism of commodities, as described by Marx in the first chapter of Capital, had been replaced by the fetishism of the plan. The main aspect of commodity fetishism, the transformation of human relations in production and society as a whole into relations between things, continued under state capitalism. In fact, she noted, Marx's original concept of commodity fetishism had been rooted in production relations, not the market. That's a very highly debatable concept. You can't really talk about commodity relations in distinction from the market. That's incoherent. 6. Where Pollock's mode was static, this concept of state capitalism showed a tendency toward a heightening of the social and class contradictions already existing under traditional capitalism. State capitalism, despite its outward appearance of solidity and cohesion, was a highly unstable, explosive social system. As early as the 1958 edition of Marxism and Freedom, Dunayevskaya wrote that the 1953 uprising in East Germany and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 represented, quote, the beginning of the end of Russian totalitarianism, end quote. Yeah, that's an important side note too, is that there's this idea that totalitarianism, the concept, because it has been appropriated and used by different people, from liberals to conservatives, that the concept of totalitarianism in and of itself has something to do with right wing, but everyone from Trotsky to Victor Serge, anyone Cornelius Castoriadis, anyone, lots and lots of people within the radical left use the term totalitarianism. So it's etymology is not strictly speaking, uh, reducible to liberal Cold Warism or something like that. 7. State capitalism was a world stage of capitalist development, with the Soviet Union's single-party state showing its most crystallized form politically. All capitalist societies had strong tendencies toward totalitarianism, however, unless challenged from below. Since the early 1940s, several other theories of state capitalism have been elaborated. Among the best known are those of Tony Cliff and Charles Bettelheim. I think Charles Bettelheim Tony Cliff was a Trotskyist. Charles Bettelheim was a Maoist, at least for a large part of his life. Probably one of the more, to my understanding, one of the more sophisticated Western commentators that took on, I don't know, at least at different times. Well, I don't know. Anyway, fuck it. Among the best known of those are those of Tony Cliff and Charles Bettelheim. Cliff, a British Trotskyist, first published his theory of state capitalism in the late 1940s, despite a recent attempt by one of his co-thinkers to portray his theory as having been elaborated before that of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, Alex Kalinikos. It was an interesting thing. It's not quite related to this. But I was reading recently a piece by Alan Johnson from the 90s, which is like a review of Sean Matt Gomna's edited volume of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, which had a bunch of people from Third Camp Trotskyism in the 40s and 50s commenting on the Russian question. And one of the things that Alan says in the article is that the main there's the main contradiction is for him, according to Johnson, was not between state capitalism theories and bureaucratic collectivism theories, but between bureaucratic collectivism and state capitalist theories on the one hand, and the orthodox Trotskyist line about the Stalinist states being degenerated worker states, including states like East Germany, for instance. Anyway, it also seems that, to my understanding, like Tony Cliff's version of state capitalism theory, which apparently, according to Alan Johnson, was highly recommended by Hal Draper, who embraced bureaucratic collectivism as a third camp Shachtmanite. I think their concepts are radically different, and I think in one of the papers that I have on here by Thomas Martin, he basically says that you can't reduce state capitalism theory to that of Tony Cliff, but I think because the Socialist Workers' Party is very large in the Socialist Workers' Party UK is very large and very prominent, and in the UK, it's easy, at least in the United Kingdom, for state capitalism theories to be reduced to that espoused by the Socialist Workers' Party UK, that was started by Tony Cliff and is now under the leadership of Kalinikos, or at least he was the leader at one point. As against both Pollock's concept and that of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, Cliff's theory remains largely within traditional Trotskyist conceptions. Still later, Bettelheim, a French economist with Maoist leanings, developed a theory of Soviet state capitalism, again on more traditional Marxist premises quite different from the more innovative ones of either the Johnson-Forrest tendency or the Frankfurt School. Aspects of the latter conceptions of state capitalism moved both Dunayevskaya and one Frankfurt School member, Erich Fromm, to elaborate concepts of Marxist humanism from the late 1950s onward. Yeah, I think I'm not as sure. I think some of my readings on my understandings of state capitalism depend upon what I've read from Paresh Chattopadhyay. And I think Paresh Chattopadhyay, though being like something akin to, I think you would say he's a council communist. But he was an academic, and I think that he learned a lot from Charles Bettelheim. I'm not exactly sure about the content of that learning, but obviously Paresh Chattopadhyay is not a Maoist. And I think that I can't remember exactly, but I think if you listen to like one of the what's that goofy guy's name, Doug Green, from like I don't know, it's like a fucking like Stalinist or a very confused Trotskyist. Uh, he has a lecture on Bettelheim. He has like the thing on his channel that were like, I thought there were some of them were pretty useful. The kind of like these biographies of various Marxist thinkers and actors and whatnot. And the Charles Bettelheim thing, I feel like he makes like the offhanded comment that eventually Charles Bettelheim moved into like something like kind of anarchistic or something like that at the end of his life, like kind of like, I don't know, changed course in the latter part of his development. But I think that and if you listen to this one lecture by Stephen A. Smith, that's on the Social Histories of Revolution channel, about his book Red Petrograd Revisited or something. He talks about his own political development. He said when he lived in France for a while and he was part of a libertarian Maoist group, and that's kind of a weird ass thing to say. That's like saying like I'm in a libertarian Stalinist group, but basically he was saying, but I was like, if there is such thing as some kind of Maoist moved into like a libertarian direction, I wonder if it was oriented around Bettelheim, because it seems like in like the 1980s, specifically in the 1980s, not like earlier, not earlier Bettelheim. But I wonder if that was the case because Stephen Smith and I don't know. Basically, I'm curious. I have a bit of a prejudice against Bettelheim because he's a Maoist, and but I should read some of his comments on the USSR, especially his later ones. Anyway, from state capitalism to Marxist humanism. After World War II, especially by the 1950s, radical thought faced new questions posed by nuclear weapons, the Nazi death camps, and Stalin's forced labor camps. These new issues appeared not only within Marxist theory, but also from within existentialism, third world liberation movements, and even Catholic theology. It was increasingly argued that the stress of 1930s radicalism on economic equality was insufficient and that genuinely radical thought had to mean dignity and liberation for the human person. From very different vantage points, writers as diverse as Sartre and Dunayevskaya argued against the relativism and tolerance of liberal democracy, which had been unable to meet the challenge of fascism. As the writings of young Marx, especially the 1844 manuscripts, began to be discussed in Western Europe and the United States, Marxist humanism was posed as an alternative to Stalinist ideology. Marxist and radical philosophers became very interested in Hegelian thought, which achieved a sudden popularity, especially in France, where some of the older Marxist thinkers, such as György Lukács or Ernst Bloch, embraced Hegel but avoided the issue of humanism. Others connected Hegel to Marxist humanism. Among the first to raise the issue of Marxist humanism were East European dissident Marxists in the 1950s. To them, the writings of the young Marx offered a critique of their own actually existing totalitarian society. As a side note, I have a bunch of essays on the channel from the compendium I think it's just called Socialist Humanism, edited by Erich Fromm in the early 1960s, I believe. And in that compendium, there's a lot of commentary from different people within, like, I guess oriented around he says East Europeans, but I think there's definitely people from the Praxis group, and I think some like Polish dissidents as well. Maybe some Czechs too, like Karel Kosík's in there. I think Mihailo Markovic or whatever, and Adam Schaff of Poland. Wolfgang Abendroth, he's West German, so that's not really fit. But anyway, different people from this milieu who tried to draw on the humanism of Marx to establish new philosophical conceptions of what Marxism was all about. Anyway, in the 1844 manuscripts, these Eastern Europeans noted Marx, 1. Wrote that humanism, not communism, was the final goal of humanity. 2. Attacked, quote, vulgar forms of communism which, quote, negated the human personality. 3. Wrote that the individual was the social entity. The 1958 edition of Dunayevskaya's Marxism and Freedom contained the first published English translation of a major part of Marx's 1844 manuscripts. Her analysis connected the humanism of the young Marx to what she termed the, quote, humanism and dialectic of capital, Volume 1, end quote. As well as the, quote, new humanism she saw in the stirrings of rank-and-file labor and civil rights movements, and later on, the women's liberation movement. If that was the beginning, I think the first English translation of the 1844 manuscripts that I think was pretty full was Erich Fromm's Marx's Conception of Man, or something like that. One profound East European study was Kosík's Dialectics of the Concrete, published in Czech in 1963, where even the Hegelian Marxist Marcuse had written in his Reason and Revolution in 1941 of the transition from Hegel to Marx as one from philosophy to social theory. Kosík hit out against, quote, abolishing philosophy, end quote, within Marxism. This abolition, this reduction of Marx's revolutionary humanist vision to a socioeconomic theory alone, quote, transforms, end quote, Marxism, quote, into its very opposite, end quote, he wrote. Praxis, human self-creation toward freedom disappears, resulting in, quote, a closeness. Socialness is a cave in which a man is walled in, end quote. Although the language is abstract, it is hard to miss the critique of statist communism which only 2 years earlier had constructed the Berlin Wall. In 1968, these ideas figured prominently in the Prague Spring, in which Kosík and another Marxist humanist, Ivan Svitak, were prominent activists. I believe I have a Svitak essay on here from the Socialist Humanist Compendium. Svitak went into exile and Kosík was imprisoned and then made into a non-person for 2 decades. Some of Kosík's work is beginning to reappear, however. I think Haymarket, via the Historical Materialism series, just put out a big book of commentaries on Kosík. I think they might have also released something from Kosík himself. Other important East European contributions include those of Kołakowski, 1968 in Poland, and Markovic, 1965 in Yugoslavia. Kołakowski went on, I think, to become an anti-Marxist in the 80s. He wrote the big book, Main Currents of Marxism, which I think is actually, I'm not actually sure of the content of it, but I don't think he himself was a Marxist at all, and even a dissident one. And Markovic, I think, might have supported Slobodan Milosevic, even though Markovic, in other places, says very insightful things. Yeah, it's always a difficult thing, when you're to try to isolate people's trajectories and shit like that from the richness of certain moments of their work. By the 1980s, however, traditional liberal as well as religious ideologies had increasingly come to dominate the opposition movements in Eastern Europe. In the West, Erich Fromm's Marxist concept of man introduced the concept of Marxism humanism, Marxist humanism and the writings of the young Marx to a wide audience while also attacking, quote, Soviet state capitalism, end quote. The major collection which he edited, Socialist Humanism, published in 1965, included essays by Dunayevskaya, Kosík, Markovic, Zvitak, and many others. In one of his last writings before his death, a preface to Dunayevskaya's Philosophy and Revolution, Markovic made Fromm made a penetrating critique of those who insisted on identifying Marx with Soviet-type societies. Quote, few thought systems have been as distorted and sometimes even turned into their opposite as that of Karl Marx. The great conservative economist Joseph Schumpeter once expressed this distortion with a hypothetical analogy. If one had discovered Europe at the time of the Inquisition and had surmised from that the Inquisition reflected the spirit of the Gospels, then one would have behaved as those who see the ideas of Marx expressed in Soviet communism. If this distortion were only to be found among opponents of Marxism, that would scarcely be surprising. The amazing thing is that it emanates from his, quote, proponents, who convince the rest of the world that their ideology expresses the ideas of Marx. One second. End quote, Erich Fromm in Dunayevskaya, 1989. But the fullest elaboration of Marxist humanism in the period since World War II lies in the work of Dunayevskaya, who raised several issues. One, Dunayevskaya saw the issue to Hegel's dialectic not only in his concept of negativity, which Marcuse and others had stressed, but in her Philosophy and Revolution. Dunayevskaya reconcretized this concept for today as a reaching for absolute human liberation in her concept of, quote, absolute negativity as new beginning, end quote. Where others had seen the conclusion of Hegel's, quote, system as a closed totality, for Dunayevskaya at the apex of Hegel's system, quote, the self-movement is ceaseless, end quote. Dunayevskaya's very next sentence in her discussion of Hegel reads, quote, the revolt that erupted in East Germany in 1953 and came to a climax in 1956 in the Hungarian Revolution was articulated as in new points of departure was articulated also in new points of departure in theory. It was as if Hegel's absolute method as a simultaneously objective mediation had taken on flesh, end quote. In this sense, the critique of Hegel's conclusions, his, quote, absolutes, is connected intimately to the drive for human liberation in Eastern Europe. There is an intricate parallel at work here. On the one hand, Hegel's system is not a closed totality, but an open road offering a philosophy of ceaseless movement of ideas in history. On the other hand, Soviet and East European communism, oppressive totalitarian systems that they were, had not created a sustained and successful new form of domination, but rather constituted a highly unstable, explosive social system which was racked with internal contradictions. 2. Marxist humanism was the ground for the creation of a contemporary form of Marxism, Marxist humanism. Humanist concepts were traced not only to the writings of the young Marx, but as against Althusser and others, it was argued that Marx's humanism continued not only in Capital, but even in his important and little-known last writings, the ethnological notebooks. There, argued Dunayevskaya, Marx had written profoundly on issues of gender and power and returned to the radicalism of his writings of the 1840s, where the condition of women in society was seen as a measure of that society's development as a whole. 3. State capitalism continued as part of the socio-economic theory underlying Marxist humanism, but in Dunayevskaya's writings after the breakup of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, the concept of state capitalism was increasingly linked to a critique of Stalinist ideology, especially their use of Marx. In addition, as a dialectical concept, state capitalism was now paired with its, quote, negation, with new forms of workers' revolt, or with the East European revolts as a whole. Conclusion. The The 1989-90 upheavals have resulted mainly in the victory of forces which advocate a turn toward the Western-type market economy. Yet, as I have shown, strong leftist currents persist, especially in the former East Germany. While a radical anti-capitalist transformation, such as that posed in 1968 by Czechoslovakia's concept of, quote, socialism with a human face, is hardly on the agenda today, once the masses have experienced the reality of Western-style capitalism, things may turn once again in a more leftist direction. There are already some signs of this in the spring 1991 protests in Eastern Germany. At a theoretical level, Marxism has been frequently described as having been discredited by the collapse of communism and the rise of free market ideologies. I have argued that this is not true of Marxist theories of state capitalism, first developed over half a century ago. These theories not only critique Soviet-type communism as totalitarian state capitalism in which the workers had no power, but also pointed to mass revolts from inside the system, especially by workers. In addition, state capitalist theories can help us to account for the relatively smooth transition from party bureaucrat to industrial manager in the post-communist social system, a changeover that has been made by many in the Soviet and East European elites. While state capitalist theories describe the social structure of statist communism, Marxist humanism offers a theoretical grounding for a radically emancipatory praxis. Where more orthodox forms of Marxism have located the impetus for human emancipation and modernization and, quote, objective, end quote, changes in the productive forces, Marxist humanists have stressed the subjective side of historical development, rooting themselves in Hegelian dialectics and Marx's concept of praxis. For those who, like Wallerstein and other radical Marxists and humanists, not only reject the notion that Marxism is, quote, dead, but who also are skeptical of the pragmatist modernism of theorists such as Habermas, the concepts of state capitalism and Marxist humanism may offer a vantage point for the needed rethinking of radical social theory in the wake of the upheavals of 1989-90. While it would be naive to assume that a radical humanist transformation is on the agenda today in Germany, Eastern Europe, or the Soviet Union, it would be equally wrong to overlook the deep liberatory mass democratic nature of the recent upheavals. Their labor dimension, their mass self-activity, and their creative grassroots democratic forms of organization and action show a yearning for forms of life and labor which go beyond existing political and social structures. June 1st, 1991. Kevin B. Anderson.